The first candle we light on this, the first Sunday of Advent, is the candle for hope. And we really do need hope this Advent season. Because hope these days seems a feeble thing. The New York Times, as of the first Sunday of Advent, reports that over the past 2 weeks, the U.S. set a record of 2 million new virus cases. And it's anticipated, if the pattern holds, for the whole month of November, we will likely hit 4.5 million cases. More than double that of any previous month. And we don't know what to expect in December, but more of the same. Since February of this year, we have had over 250,000 people who died in the U.S. from this pandemic. 250,000 people. In one day in this country, we have more people die of COVID-19 than were killed in the attack on the World Trade Center. These numbers are mind-numbing and almost impossible to wrap our heads around in any sort of sense of proportion. Lighting a candle of hope in Advent seems a feeble thing. The rise in cases and the out-of-control nature of this pandemic has put a strain on our healthcare system, overwhelming doctors and nurses and other medical care professionals. The loss of jobs due to the epidemic, the economic impact on everyday people, likely resulting in record numbers of unemployment, people losing their homes, their shelter, many having to face long lines, and food scarcity for the first time, face long lines at food pantries. Images we are beginning to see more and more of. COVID-19 has once again revealed the inequalities existing in our society between the rich and poor. It's far more devastating impact on communities of color. The lack of healthcare resources in our more rural communities. Lighting an Advent candle of hope seems a feeble thing. And COVID-19 has exposed the paralysis of our government, locked in partisan ideological gridlock, unable to respond in effective ways to the pain, the suffering, and needs of our communities. It's almost as if many of our leaders are burying their head in the sand in denial of the reality around us. Seems we spend more time debating mass mandates and personal rights and responsibilities. And while it might be easy to blame individuals for their choices in the midst of COVID-19, the challenges we face are not due to those individuals, but to the inability of our leaders to actually lead. Hope seems a feeble thing. And add to this our own siloed and isolated lives we are living in order to prevent further spread of the virus. We find ourselves yearning for the very things that we need to bring us hope and joy. The very things we need is other people. My son asked me the other day how long it had been since Heartland had worshiped together in person, and I'll be honest, I couldn't remember, March or something like that. And God knows I, like you, am missing seeing everyone. Zoom is great, our online worship is great, but it's still not the same. We need human connection to find hope, the physical presence of others, so vitally a part of what it means to be a human and hopeful. So the season of Advent, as we light this first candle representing hope, it does seem a feeble thing. And I am reminded of a line from an Emily Dickinson poem that actually this week has been echoing in my head and soul as we light that candle, as we start this Advent season. She wrote, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tunes without words and never stops at all." Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tunes without words and never stops at all. I thought of that line this week in part because Emily Dickinson, probably one of the greatest American poets, lived a pretty siloed, isolated life of her own. Many scholars cited various reasons she lived so isolated. Many might diagnose clinical depression. She suffered the loss of dear ones early in her life, made her very much aware of mortality and her afraid of it. She lived as this gifted woman in a deeply patriarchal world that never recognized her gifts. Some scholars say she was gay, living in a society which hated gays. So I thought of Emily Dickinson, famous for her isolation, and I thought of her as a kindred soul these days in our own isolation and loneliness. And yet, she could write that line. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tunes without words and never stops at all. That line from that point echoed in me in part because of an odd detail in the story we read this morning. Zechariah, doing his work, doing his duty at the temple, receives this visit from the angel Gabriel. And this angel Gabriel tells him that he and his wife Elizabeth will have a son who will be a joy and a delight to them. And upon hearing that, he finds that too hard to believe. I'm too old. We're too infertile. There is no way, there is no hope for that possibility. And therefore, he is struck silent and cannot speak the words of hope. Because he really, really couldn't believe that that could happen. He wasn't able to. They were too old, they were too infertile, they lived in the shame of a society of being unable to bear children. They were without hope. But then God comes and hope becomes a thing with feathers that perched in their souls and sang tunes without words and never stopped at all. I imagine as he left that temple, Zechariah felt that feathery touch of hope. It perched somewhere deep within him, and while he could not put it in words, it sang. It sang in his heart, in his mind, and in his soul, and it never stopped. And that reminds me in our experience with God and God's activity in our lives, that is how hope works with us. It is something deep within us. It might be light and feathery, almost seemingly non-existent, and yet it is there, deep in the recesses of our souls. And while we maybe cannot fully express it in words, we feel it sing within us of possibility. it never stops. Not even in the midst of the tragedy of COVID and suffering and grief around us, it sings with words we cannot speak, perched right here within us. And I recognize that song, if not the words. I recognize and feel that hope, that thing of feathers singing in my soul when I hear of the dedication of the doctors and nurses who go out to work every day at risk to their own health to care for the sick and the dying. Hope never stops. And that thing with feathers sings in my soul when I see and hear of teachers who work so hard, whether in person or over the internet, to help our kids learn and help them cope with this strange world we live in this day. And hope sings and never stops. And I know I feel that thing with feathers perched in my soul, and it sings when all the countless ways that people are every day doing kind and compassionate things for their neighbors, for their friends, for their family. Because the truth of it is, hope never stops. There's a quote from an African-American activist, her name's Sonia Renee Taylor, who wrote recently, "We will not go back to normal. Normal never was. Our pre-corona existence was not normal other than we normalized greed and inequity, exhaustion, depletion, extraction, disconnection, confusion, rage, hoarding, hate, and lack. We should not long to return, my friends. We are being given the opportunity to stitch a new garment, one that fits all of humanity and nature. That even as we light this candle in the night of darkness of COVID-19, even as we struggle in the midst of such suffering and grief and death, hope never stops. And we believe as we light that candle in the darkness, as we feel the feathery touch of hope that sings within us, even if we cannot put words to it, that God is leading us to possibility, a new possibility, an amazing possibility that is not what existed before, but will be born anew. That is the promise of Advent. And I don't know about you, but I do know that when we go back and are able to worship in person, I will never, ever take that for granted again. That when we go back to the time when we can be in person with each other after vaccines, I will never, ever take for granted that hug passed along in passing the peace. Something new is happening. And hope never stops. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.